Okay, so as always, what I'm gonna do is underline the things that you are expected to write, and I will give you time to write those things down. But if you are somebody who likes to write every single word, you might not have time to do that. This is online, the video will be online, so you can write that stuff down later if you need to. And what we're going to be talking about today are community interactions. Those are interactions between organisms, not between organisms and non-living part of the environment. We don't think about the interaction between a tree and the water in the soil as a community interaction. That is an interaction, but it's not a community interaction. But interactions between trees and other living organisms like moss or birds or fungus or ants, all of those would be considered community interactions. And these are really cool. They're really fun to think about. And one of the nice things for you is most of these you've heard of already. The most complicated ones are the ones that fall under the category of a symbiosis. That's why we're having you all do a symbiosis poster so that you can think about those interactions in a little bit more detail. The rest of them are ones that you've probably seen before. So the skills we're going to work on are, first of all, how well can you describe and characterize community interactions? Describe means that you could tell us about them. If I asked you, what is a predator-prey relationship? What does that look like? You would be able to tell me a little bit about the kinds of things that happen in predator-prey relationships. And if I were to give you an example of something, if I were to say there's two plants, they're both growing in the same little patch of land, and there's not very many nutrients in the soil, what type of interaction might characterize those two plants? You would be able to say, oh, that sounds like maybe competition is involved. And then the next thing would be, can you give examples? So if I were to ask you to give me an example of a mutualistic, symbiotic interaction, I would like you to be able to either give me a description of something real or even make something up. It's like memorization is not the key skill that we're working on in this class, but being able to apply your understanding is. So if you know mutualism is the kind of interaction where two organisms work together symbiotically and they both benefit, and you can't think of anything off the top of your head, you can make something up. There's a crazy organism called the snorks, and the snorks live with blah, blah, blah. You can make it up, and that will clearly convey that you understand the concept of a mutualistic symbiosis. You do not have to write down this stuff. We're going to go through these in a little bit more detail one by one, but the different interactions that we're going to look at are predation, where we have one organism killing and consuming another organism. Generally, we think about predation as animals, although there are some organisms that aren't animals that are potentially considered prey organisms as well. And then there's herbivory, where we have plants that are being consumed. There is competition, where we have two organisms that are attempting to use the same kinds of resources. And then there's symbiosis, where we have two or more sometimes organisms that are their lives are so closely intertwined that at least one of them is dependent on the other. You don't have one without the other. Sometimes both of them fall into that category. Sometimes it's just one of them. And symbiosis is the toughest one because with the symbiosis, there's sort of a degree, right? There is a point at which we kind of ask ourselves, well, do they really need this? They seem to really prefer it. They seem to almost rely on it, but it's hard to know if they really need it or not. Sometimes those things are still categorized as symbioses. And you'll see that in the research that you're doing. Almost certainly some of you are going to find examples of things where, well, we call it a symbiosis because it's kind of a neat interaction. But the reality is, if one of those organisms disappeared, the other one would probably figure something out. It would probably still be able to survive, in which case it wouldn't technically be a symbiosis, but it's a fuzzy line, not a sharp line that distinguishes symbiosis from other types of interactions. So let's start with predation. Predation is, so predation is sometimes kind of intense to think about. Many people really like the idea of thinking about predation. It's one of the things that a lot of biologists study. It's the topic of a lot of nature shows, and sometimes it's a little too grisly for people to think about. I'm not gonna make a big deal about the grisly parts of this, but I also am not gonna tell you that you shouldn't think about that. So I'm not making moralistic statements here. I mean, as we all know, like, organisms in nature, they're not making moral or ethical choices. So when an owl eats a mouse, it's not thinking to itself, well, gosh, could I eat something that doesn't feel pain, or how can I do this in a way that, causes the least, like, it's just hungry and it eats. One of the things that we are super interested in with predation is that it turns out that, and one of the things that's so cool about this sort of ecology is that we didn't necessarily know this until relatively recently. It turns out that when we think about the organisms that consume other organisms, there are side effects of that consumption. And sometimes those side effects can be really important, either to other organisms or even to us. So for example, there's something called a keystone species. And what a keystone species does is it sort of regulates not just one organism and not just a small group of organisms that it eats, but it can regulate an entire ecosystem. And I'll give you an example of that in just a second. So I do want to have you write down that predation occurs when one organism kills and eats another. Sorry. And then this idea of a keystone species is something I do want you to write down as well. So a keystone species is something that we don't really necessarily know what a keystone species is until it's gone. And then as soon as it's gone, what we see is a cascade of changes in other organisms. So for example, in Yellowstone, about 100 years ago, people thought, well, wolves aren't great to have around. They eat a lot of organisms that people like to hunt, like deer and elk, and they're kind of mean and scary, and they often can get into like pasture lands and kill and eat sheep and cows and horses and goats. And so at the time, 100 years ago, people thought, well, let's just get rid of wolves. They don't really do any good. If we get rid of them, we'll have way more deer and elk and all these other things that we really like to have. So they killed all of the wolves, every last one of them in Yellowstone Park. They hunted them from airplanes, they hunted them from cars, they hunted them from the ground, they hunted them from horses, they hunted them to extinction locally. And sure enough, the deer and the elk populations exploded. And at first, a lot of people were really happy about that. In fact, for decades, a lot of people were like, hooray, we saved them. And then they started to see some really interesting side effects. One of the side effects was that with more deer and elk, they were eating more vegetation, way more vegetation. They were eating young trees, they were eating grasses, they were eating flowers. Another side effect was that all those additional deer and elk were trampling all over the place, and they needed to drink water, so they were trampling stream beds. And then the next thing that people noticed is that in the streams, there were fewer beavers, because beavers need young trees and an intact stream ecosystem in order to build their dams. And so the streams were getting trampled, and the trees were all getting eaten, so the beaver population plummeted. And the fish population plummeted too. The fish population plummeted because they need clean, clear water, and they like deep pools. Fish benefit a lot from beaver dams. Beaver dams weren't there. The streams were getting trampled. The shade was gone because deer and elk were eating all the trees. And so fish populations plummeted. And that impacted bears, because bears eat fish. And what happened was what we call a trophic cascade. There was this massive chain reaction that happened because we eliminated wolves in Yellowstone, and it literally changed the ecosystem. So in the 90s, we thought, well, okay, wait a second, what if? And people returned wolves to Yellowstone. And interestingly enough, all of that stuff has started to reverse. There are now self-sustaining populations of wolves. That has resulted in much lower populations of deer and elk. That reduced the grazing pressure, that reduced the trampling, the beavers have come back, the fish have returned. Some of these things are maybe irreversible that humans have done, but in this case it turned out to be a largely reversible thing. And I'm not moralizing about wolves, like some of you think that's great, some of you are like, well, I still would rather not have wolves around. But ecologically, there's no question that wolves were a keystone species in Yellowstone. And so this piece where you get a whole bunch of changes to an environment because of the disappearance of a keystone species is called a trophic cascade. So a trophic cascade is what happens when a whole bunch of other organisms change in abundance. Some of them might become more abundant, some of them might become less abundant, but there's shifts in the populations of organisms when one keystone species goes away. The most important work with keystone species was done in the late 60s by a guy named Robert Payne, and I had the privilege of working with him when I was at the University of Washington. He was a super smart, super nice guy, and he kind of helped me learn ecology. But his initial study had to do with sea stars, and I think we talked about this a while ago, but with sea stars, what he discovered is that if you look at a tide pool that has sea stars in it, you'll see a whole bunch of other organisms. If you take those sea stars out, and that's what he did, his research basically consisted of picking sea stars out of tide pools, chucking them. And what happened was mussels took over. They were basically nothing but mussels. So if you have sea stars, the sea stars eat the mussels, and then other organisms can come in. Without the sea stars, the mussels took over. So we didn't know that either. Sea stars are a keystone species. So that's predation. And one of the things that we see with predation are these cycles of predator-prey relationships. And this is something we may look at down the road. This is not something that we're going to talk about in detail now. But one of the things that's really cool is we can see it in real data, and we can see it in predicted data, which we call modeling in biology, where basically what happens is if prey increase in abundance, then their predators have more to eat. And so they increase in abundance, but then they eat more prey. And that causes prey levels to decrease, but with less food. The predators become less abundant as well. But now that there's fewer predators, the prey can increase, and we see these cycles repeated in areas that are relatively undisturbed and that have a relatively stable environment. These predator-prey cycles can be tracked over decades or even hundreds of years, so that's kind of neat. This we may or may not talk about in more detail down the road. One of the most fun things about predator-prey interactions are the adaptations that result. And we're going to talk about adaptations specifically in the spring. Adaptations are an evolutionary thing. But for now, you can just think of adaptations as neat, useful things that organisms have. And so when we think about predator-prey adaptations, one of the things that has resulted from predator-prey relations is camouflage. That can happen for both predators or prey. For example, that's an owl right there. Yeah, you can maybe see it now. There's the ears, the beak is right there, the body of the owl is right here. Some predators are so well camouflaged that people have been in the same environment as the predator, and they didn't realize it until they looked at a picture later. And you can see this, this is just one example of it, but one of the things that's really scary is how many pictures there are where there's a cougar in the picture and nobody saw it. They didn't see it, they didn't sense it, they didn't hear it, and then later they look at the picture and holy cow, that's a cougar right there. So that's a really neat thing. The prey species can also exhibit some sort of camouflage. Sometimes it's a special kind of camouflage that is not designed to make it sort of blend into the environment, but it's designed to make it look like something else. So we can have this cryptic coloration that makes things hard to see. Or we can have these defensive markings, so like this moth, it has these big spots that kind of look like eyes. And so what scientists think is that this sort of fools a predator into thinking, oh, that's some big scary thing, better not eat that. There are also mechanical defenses, like physical things, so spikes or quills, so like a porcupine. And how many of you have had any sort of close encounter with a porcupine? Was it you or was it an animal? Dog?
I was with my dog.
Yeah.
She like ran out in front of me, and then this like came out and I talked to her.
Yeah, so that happened to me once too with my old dog. This was probably like 20 years ago now. We're just walking through the woods up by Oak Creek, and all of a sudden she just tore off into the woods, which she did, and I hated it. Most of the time, like 90% of the time, she was the best dog ever, and 10% of the time she was like a demon. And so she turned into a demon, she runs off into the bushes, and then I hear this, and then she comes back, and at first I'm like, what do you have in your mouth, Riley? And then she comes up closer, and I realize that it's just quills. She's just got quills sticking out of her face. They're in her nose, they're through her lips. So I had to go home, I took care of some of them, but I had to go home and de-quill my dog's face for 45 minutes, so that was kind of crazy. So that is a very effective defense against predation. Quills, by the way, are modified hairs. They evolved from hair. Porcupines are mammals, just like us, but instead of having like luscious, beautiful locks like I do, they have, sorry, I just wanted to make sure it was all tucked in under there. They have these sharp, spiky quills that their hair evolved from. And then there's chemical defenses, and those are really cool, and many of you are familiar with newts. Newts are super common in the Pacific Northwest. If you didn't know this, it's relatively commonly known, but some of us don't know it. They're also incredibly toxic. They secrete a toxin that can kill you. Now, it's not likely to kill you if you just sort of encounter it, but if you ingest the toxin, it can be really, really dangerous. And so one thing you should know about these things is, as cute and fun as they are, if you handle them, you better wash your hands before you get them anywhere near your mouth. Don't drink anything, don't eat anything until your hands are totally clean, because they secrete a deadly chemical. And there's more to the newt story than that, but I'm gonna leave it there. Herbivory is our next category of interactions, and herbivory is when we have an organism that eats all or part of a plant. And that's, you were familiar with predator-prey relationships, but you're very familiar with herbivory. Herbivory is very easy to categorize, it's very easy to identify. And what's really interesting about herbivory is that, kind of like the whole keystone species thing, it turns out that in most ecosystems, there's sort of an ideal level of herbivory. And if you think about your own yard, and whether, if you have one, if you live in a place where you have a little bit of land, and most of you know, the plants can grow out of control. One of the things that many homeowners spend a lot of time on is yard work. Why do you have to do yard work? Because if we don't cut the grass and trim the shrubs and trim the trees, pull the weeds, things will get overgrown in a hurry. And in a non-human environment, that abundance of vegetation is regulated by herbivory. We have organisms that eat all or part of plants, and so there's a lot of sort of natural regulation of plant abundance. And one of those super interesting things, and you all know a little bit about this, is that when we have an introduced species, a non-native species, those organisms often don't have any natural herbivores that eat them. So one of the reasons that Himalayan blackberry and English ivy are such a problem in the Pacific Northwest is there's not a lot of organisms that eat those plants. Sure, the berries get eaten, but that just spreads the plant. There's not many things that eat Himalayan blackberry. I've heard, and some of you probably know more about this than me, I've heard that goats will. Anybody know anything about goats eating Himalayan blackberry? Yeah.
They eat everything.
Yeah, goats eat everything. They'll eat like supposedly tin cans and stuff like that. So I don't know, but I'm not a goat person, but that's something that is like potentially a way of controlling. Like I have heard people say, like, for Himalayan blackberry, basically if you've got a lot of it on your property, you really only have two choices. One, spray it with something horrible, or two, get a bunch of goats. So I don't know if that's true or not. The next category of interaction is called competition, and competition is super fun because we know, like, we sort of can imagine what it looks like, especially when it's animals, right? And so when you have organisms that are competing, what they're competing for are things that we call resources. And so there's a couple things about competition that's fun. One is when it's animals and we see it happening, it can be pretty intense. Like two organisms competing for the same, like, tangible resource can be really incredibly powerful to watch. And most often, that resource that we see animals squabbling over is going to be food. So we have a vulture and maybe a coyote or a hyena or something here that are battling over some dead animal, a couple of scavengers that are battling over a food resource. Whatever, like for every kilogram of meat on the ground, there's only one organism that can eat that. And so these organisms are literally often battling it out, and that's really fun. And water is another thing that organisms can compete for. Water is interesting though, because if you think about animals, that competition is maybe not as intense. And in fact, usually, water isn't something that organisms will fight over. We don't see that sort of behavior. Lakes and rivers and ponds and stuff like that, we just don't see this kind of behavior. Food is a more limited resource for animals, typically. But what does compete for water are plants. Plants are incredible competitors for water. We don't see it happen though, but plants compete with each other. And plants can also compete with each other for space. And space is kind of cool because if we think about space, hang on, I want to show you this. When we think about space, one of the things that you see in a environment where we're looking at a plant community is every available space that can support some sort of a living organism has it. We got trees that are covered with lichens and moss, and rocks that are covered with lichens and moss. We have plants growing out of the bark of trees. There are things called epiphytes that, like mistletoe, that grow up in the top, like mistletoe grows in big oak trees up at the very top. Every inch of space that can possibly be occupied and colonized is occupied and colonized. And for plants, typically, as they compete for space, they're also competing for sunlight. Those are two separate resources, but they kind of go hand in hand. And then the other interesting one to think about is mates. Animal organisms compete with other animals to reproduce. And so one of the really cool things that has happened is something that we call sexual selection, in which organisms advertise their availability for reproduction. And so you get this like the coloration, and you get like these crazy adaptations that are simply designed to say, hey, I'm ready to reproduce. That's it. And so it's like a reproductive advertisement, and a lot of the colorations and stuff like that serve no other purpose. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is symbiosis. So this is what you all are working on today, and as soon as I am done here, this is what you're going to be spending the rest of the period on. But these symbioses are extremely close interactions. What does that mean? Practical terms, in practical terms, we think about a symbiosis as something where one or both of the organisms is dependent on the other. And those can be a mutualistic relationship, and this I'm going to ask you all to write down. A mutualistic relationship is where both organisms benefit. So lichen is an example of a mutualistic relationship. The algae gets protection, the fungus gets sugar from photosynthesis. There can be a relationship that's called commensalism. And commensalism is where one of the organisms is really helped by the relationship, and the other doesn't really have an effect one way or the other. And a lot of times we think about lichens growing on trees as a commensal relationship. Lichens are dependent on trees because they need to get close to sunlight. And the trees are up high, and so the lichens can get sunlight by growing on the trees. But lichens do the trees no harm at all. They don't get nutrients from the trees, they don't take sugars from the trees, they don't do anything to the tree. They're light, they don't cause any trouble. So, it's a beneficial relationship for the lichens, and it doesn't really do much either way for the trees. And then the last kind of symbiosis is parasitism. Parasitism is when one organism lives in or on another organism and harms it. And parasitism would be like the fluke. That's a type of organism that was living inside that snail that we saw in the Living Together movie, where the parasite goes into the snail and basically takes over the snail. The parasite benefits because that's part of its reproductive cycle, and the snail sort of loses because it gets torn apart by a bird, and it stops behaving in a way that's really beneficial for the snail. This is a species called the Fender's blue butterfly, and the plant that it's on is called Kincaid's lupin. Those both occur here in the Willamette Valley, and they're both endangered species. In fact, for decades, people thought Kincaid's lupin was extinct, but they rediscovered it like 20 or 30 years ago, and now we're actively trying to save this species. Kincaid's lupin is the only plant that Fender's blue butterfly larvae will eat. And so Fender's blue butterfly will lay their eggs only on Kincaid lupin. When those eggs hatch, the larvae will eat part of the plant and then develop into the adult. So this is a good example of a symbiotic relationship. In general, we would consider this one sort of like in between parasitism and commensalism, because the larvae don't kill the plant, and they don't really do that much damage by eating a little bit of leaves, but it's not entirely commensal either. For the most part, we have a winner, which is the butterfly, and then there's a loser, which is the Kincaid's lupin. So that's sort of moving into this parasitism piece. And there's all sorts of other interactions. I'm just going to give you a couple of fun examples. One is the cowbird on bison. And so cowbirds are they're a bird. We have them around here. They're more common kind of in drier areas, like range areas. So I don't know where this picture was taken. I actually took this picture, and it's not a great picture, but I was so happy that I got a picture of a bison with a cowbird on it that I included it in this slide, even though this is really what the bird looks like in my picture. Okay, not great, but still fun. And basically what these cowbirds do is they pick parasitic organisms like fleas and ticks and lice off of the bison and eat them. And so this is a mutualistic relationship because the birds get food for, that's gross, but that's what they eat. And then the bison get all these parasitic organisms picked off of them. So it's a win-win. And this was in Yellowstone, by the way, like 15 years ago or something. And then commensalism, so this is where we have one organism benefit and the other organism isn't really affected. So I mentioned lichens or mosses on trees. And during the winter around here, when our deciduous trees lose their leaves, you can see the leaves, or the branches of the trees are just covered with lichens. And we like people sometimes refer to lichens as winter leaves. They call them winter leaves because in the summer and spring, we've got green leaves from the trees, and in the fall and the winter, we see the green from the lichens. So people kind of thought, well, maybe that's like part of the tree, part of the leaves. Mosses can also grow on trees as well, and it's the same deal. They're not mosses don't have roots. They're not extracting stuff from the trees that they grow on. And then parasitism is fun. This is one where one organism benefits and the other is harmed. And there's a couple examples that we're likely to encounter around here. One are these things right here, which you've all seen. You may not have noticed, but most of you probably have. These are the little crunchy things that are on the ground and often attached to oak leaves. Those are called spotted galls, and they are created by the oak tree when a parasitic insect called a gall wasp lays an egg in the leaf. And chemically, that egg secretes stuff that makes the leaf create this structure around it. And inside that structure is a little larvae. And one of the crazy things about these kind of parasitic relationships is there's often secondary or even tertiary interactions. So one of the things that can happen with a gall is if you find one and you look at it and it looks like there's no holes in it, if you open it up, you'll see there's like some fuzzy stuff, and then there's kind of like a hard thing in the center. And if you open up that hard thing, you'll see a little wiggly grub. That is the gall wasp larva. But if you find one of these galls and it's got a hole in it, then you open it up, you'll just see a bunch of brown crumbly crud. That brown crumbly crud is poop. And that poop came from another wasp that landed on the gall, laid its egg in the gall. It hatched into a different larvae. That larvae ate the first larvae and pooped all over the place and then left. So we've got these secondary parasitisms that can be really cool. And then the other one that you all are going to potentially see around here are things like ticks and fleas. So this right here is a tick, and it's embedded in human flesh. And I'm not going to ask how many of you have had a tick embedded in you, but if you have, it's gross. They stick their whole head under your skin, and they drink your blood, and then they get really fat. And they go on dogs, and they go on cats, and they go on all sorts of organisms, and people get ticks too. So, and we have ticks around here. So, especially in spring, summer, and early fall, you have to be careful if you're walking through like tall grass or shrubs, anything that's got a lot of like exposed vegetation that you could brush up against. Yeah.
We own like a farm type thing.
Oh yeah, you got ticks.
And we walked through it, and I got one on me, but I was lucky to notice that it was there, so I could like flick it off before it actually like embedded into me. But my dad got one, and he had to have my mom pull it out.
Yeah.
He didn't want to pull it out because
it's just really gross. Yeah. My older son got one several years ago. We were camping, and he was like we all knew there were ticks there, and he was really freaked out just about the idea of getting ticks. So we had to my wife was like distracting him. She was like, I don't know what she was doing, and I was like very quietly behind him, pulling a tick out of his leg. He never, to this day, I don't think he knows. So if any of you ever meet my son, he'll be here next year. If you meet him, do not tell him about the tick. He'll hold it against me. That's how he operates. And then there's a lot of diseases that are parasite caused. Malaria is caused by a parasite. It's caused by a protestin organism that gets into people and into mosquitoes. And so malaria isn't like a virus. It's not a bacterial infection. It is it's a protist, and it's considered parasitic. All right, so what I'm hoping now is that you all have a little bit more background for your symbiosis poster. And one of the things that I want to make sure that you do with your symbiosis poster is characterize the symbiotic relationship as either mutualist, commensalist, or parasitic, okay? And if you need to take a break, take a break. Otherwise, you have the rest of the period to work on your poster. Today is the last day to work on it, so use your time well.